I'll go when I say my intro, they will jump in. Hey, everybody, my name is Jim Farmer. I'm the festival director of Out on Film, Atlanta's LGBTQ Film Festival. I'm also an arts reporter for Georgia Voice. I'm so happy today to be speaking to director David France. David France is a director, writer, and producer known for documentaries such as Welcome to Chechnya and The Death and Life of Marsha P. Johnson. His How to Survive a Plague, which looked at the AIDS crisis, was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Documentary. And now he is back with a follow-up of sorts, How to Survive a Pandemic, which looks at the race to come up with a COVID vaccine. It's now screening on HBO. I watched it a couple of nights ago. It is phenomenal. Thank you so much, David.
Oh my, thank you, Jim. Great to be
Yeah,
here.
good to see. Well, I wanted to ask you first of all. I mean, everybody has their own COVID story, but where were you when you first heard of COVID? And like most of us, did you think it was just going to be a 2 week event?
I was actually in Berlin
Okay.
with my previous film, Welcome to Chechnya.
Yeah.
We were at the Berlinale Film Festival, and when we started hearing the murmurs, over
Mhm.
social media that something odd was happening, we uh, were nervous about it. Naturally, we were grateful to leave there. None of us apparently too unhealthy as a result. Um, but it wasn't until another film festival following that immediately, True False in Columbia, Missouri, that it was really clear that this was a disaster and we were all on our way home
Okay.
for the foreseeable future. So I came back to New York, where I live, and hunkered down through the first moments of lockdown.
Mhm.
We were still communicating every day with my crew from Chechnya, and trying to figure out what we're going to do with the rest of our festival runs with that film. And we were almost immediately fixated on a vaccine. We wanted to
Sure.
know where the vaccines were. We recognized that a vaccine was really the only solution that would allow us to go back outside. The parks in New York City had closed. The sound of ambulances were everywhere. And so we started what turned into research for the documentary, but at first was really only self-preservation. Where is this? Where's it coming from? Who's doing what? When can we get it? And how can we know the newest news? And that's when we realized how invisible vaccine research is. It's
Exactly.
done behind the closed doors of biosafety labs and whatnot. And we started talking to people who are doing that work and said, it's this is this is the most consequential scientific undertaking of our lifetimes,
Sure.
and we should find a way to chronicle it. And that's what started this project.
Okay. How long total did you work on this?
We worked on it right through last year. So it
Okay.
was, we wanted to give a year of reporting to after the arrival of the vaccines, to find out how well they do in actually ending the crisis. So we set as this end point for us the end of 2021, the first full year of vaccines.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about the Trump administration and some of the major mistakes the administration made in getting ready for a vaccination, for vaccines?
Well, there was almost nothing good that came from the Trump administration. I mean, I feel like it's cliche even to say that.
Yeah.
So every mistake imaginable, was lined up and executed perfectly. What hasn't been said often enough is that Operation Warp Speed, which is the name that the administration gave to their scientific undertaking, aligning it up with the moonshot, the Manhattan Project, and other enormous undertakings, that turned out to be a great success. That, in fact, throwing that money at pharma and empowering the military to work on logistics and scientists to work at the bench, and industry to work at setting up manufacturing at risk, that all paid off tremendously. It allowed us to not only discover the vaccine compounds and platforms, but also to bring them through human trials, large-scale phase 3 human trials in record time, 11 months. It was really phenomenal. So they deserve some credit for that. It was done in the middle of utter chaos, as you can remember, from the administration in its handling of the vaccine. And that chaos undermined the towering accomplishments of the vaccine, in that so many Americans have so little faith in the vaccine, even today, that that hesitancy, as they call it politely, is still a major barrier to bringing the United States and so much of the rest of the world even out of the pandemic.
Exactly. I remember when the vaccinations became available, there was such a fervor for everybody to get those. But there were some missteps that came along with the rollout. Can you talk about some of those missteps?
Well, the one thing that was problematic, the main kind of principal problematic part for the rollout in the United States, is that the Trump administration determined that it would not be a federal initiative, but a state by state initiative. No effort was made to prepare the states for the largest vaccine rollout initiative in world history. So there was just this wild lack of preparation in every state in the country for getting the vaccines out. And so they sat for long times in places. There was no federal money to help set up vaccination posts or clinics. And that bottleneck that was created by that hands-off federal role was really significant. The bigger problem is that the administration, and even the subsequent the Biden administration, paid tragically little attention to the importance of rolling the vaccine out to the rest of the world at the same time. And what that resulted in, as we've all witnessed, is the creation of these variants that come back to challenge and threaten the very accomplishments that the vaccines represent. So in not pressing for equitable distribution, the U.S. had this theory that they could vaccinate the United States into an island of COVID-free people, proved to be faulty in its fundamentals.
I was so surprised watching this documentary, because I feel like I know a good amount about this. There's so much great information here, but one of the things that struck me was that there were some countries that got vaccinations really, really quickly, and some poorer countries that did not get the vaccinations as quickly. Can you talk about that?
Well, that's where the whole disaster was perpetrated. The rich countries, the United States included, hoarded doses. The U.S. is still hoarding doses of these vaccines at a time when the demand for them is almost non-existent. They have been trickling some of that stockpile into this initiative set up by the World Health Organization called COVAX that sought to guarantee access to the lower and middle income countries. And they're now getting enough vaccine to begin to imagine a time when the rest of the world will be vaccinated. But here we are a year after vaccination started in the West, and it's still, well, at the end of last year, only 8% of people in low-income countries were vaccinated. Wow. And today it's more like 14%. So it's still not what was established by epidemiologists and public health officials as the absolute minimum for the first round, which is 20% of the population in every country. And that 20% seems like an arbitrary figure, but if you take just the at-risk individuals, just the people with comorbidities, and just the healthcare workers of any country, you bring that represents 20% in that nation. And if we had been able to bring that 20% up across the globe simultaneously, we would have removed this potential for the virus to find people whose immunities were compromised, people who had relatively large unvaccinated populations, and that's where the vaccine ricocheted around to the point of mutation, and the creation of this ongoing creation of variants. So far, the vaccines have been pretty strong against the variants, but there really is, unfortunately, the solid potential, even still today, year 3 of the pandemic, that something really disastrous will still emerge from that unvaccinated population.
Jeez. In my naivete, I just assumed that everybody would run out to get in line for vaccinations. As we all know, there's some people who adamantly did not want to get vaccinated. Can you talk? I mean, can you talk about that and the fact that that surprised so many people?
Such a good question. I mean, we knew that there was going to be an anti-vax,
Mm-hmm.
uh, sector of the population. That we knew they existed because they had been resisting earlier vaccination, childhood vaccination campaigns, etc. Um, and we assumed that that would include a large portion of the more marginalized communities in the U.S., given their lack of incorporation into the modern healthcare in the U.S., for example, given all the historical crimes committed by science against them. I'm talking about the Tuskegee experiment, for example, in which the U.S. Public Health Service knowingly allowed 128 people to die of syphilis in the African American community in order to be able to chronicle the course of a natural syphilis infection, even though it was already known how to treat syphilis. So they were really immorally kept from the knowledge of what treatments were available to them. So, and that has lasting impact in many communities. It's not a long ago historical event. It's a living and ongoing knowledge. So we expected to find some hesitancy there, and in fact we did. And it was hesitancy that the film chronicles, and it required wise interventions in order to be able to ready those communities for the vaccination campaign once it was available to them. Ultimately, surprising though is that it soon became clear that communities of color in the U.S. were open to the argument that the vaccines were sound and essential. And obviously, it was a community that was harder hit than any other in the United States. What emerged was this strange and very unexpected hesitancy on the part of Republicans. It became a white issue, and kind of a Trumpist issue. Something like 60% of ardent Trump followers were resistant to taking the vaccine. It's still the largest portion of unvaccinated Americans are white and rural Americans who are Trump's base. That was totally unexpected. Nobody saw it coming. It's strange, Jim, because it's Trump's biggest accomplishment, the vaccine. And yet they actually don't believe that Trump would even take it himself, though we know he's taken it. He didn't do it in public the way most forward-leaning political leaders did. He didn't let us see him take the vaccine, so he's left it into this rumor phase or place where it's really unclear to his followers what they should think about it. I know he got himself in some trouble with his base last month, I think, when he was arguing in favor of the boosters. And I think it was on Laura Ingram's show, and she was horrified, and she kept saying, "But these things are dangerous," and he would say no, but he has gotten himself involved too little and too late in trying to correct the deep anti-science sentiments that he helped stoke at the beginning of his administration.
Sure. Another thing that the documentary does so beautifully, it really points out that while people around the world were dying and fighting for their lives, for some people this was about profiteering and making as much money as you can off of a vaccine. Can you talk about that aspect?
Yeah, absolutely. We kept asking ourselves at the beginning of this, what are the lessons that we learned from the HIV/AIDS pandemic? that we think will allow this pandemic to have a more ethical course. And one of the things that we learned was how horrible it was to not allow antiretrovirals to be accessed by the majority of the world. Effective drugs against HIV became available in clinics in 1996, but they were priced at this phenomenally high rate, and
Sure.
which put them entirely out of the reach of the rest of the world, where HIV was just endemic and claiming lives by the millions. It took a decade of activism before those prices were driven down low enough so that we could start making the drugs available to the rest of the world. And that activism today has allowed almost 20 million people around the world to access highly active antiretroviral drugs. Phenomenal, but how many millions of people died in the interim when it would have been possible to do that from day one? And we thought maybe that's a lesson that would be taken to heart by the major pharmaceutical companies. And some of them, in fact, did do that. Johnson & Johnson announced from the very beginning that it was making its vaccine available at cost. And that was, even in the West, $2 per dose. And cheaper still around the rest of the world. AstraZeneca did the same thing. Pfizer was not as generous. And the worst of the offenders was Moderna, which did not even give lower price points for the rest of the world and wouldn't take orders from the rest of the world. They, as a corporate model and strategy, wanted to use their vaccine to enrich the company and to wring as much money out of Western treasuries as possible. And they're still doing that. I mean, they're still leading this charge of money over humanity, and totally unacceptable. We should be seeing street protests. We've seen a few protests at their doorstep, but I think that the entire globe should be up in arms about this.
Exactly. This isn't a question, just more of a comment. I've seen some other documentaries that deal with COVID, and yours just feels so complex and layered. Congratulations, because it really just talks about so much, COVID itself, the vaccination, the after effects. So congratulations on that. I wanted to ask you, do you find that the LGBT community, having gone through, the AIDS crisis, takes or took COVID more seriously than their counterparts?
Well, I think those folks in my generation who experienced the worst years of the American AIDS pandemic, 1981 to 1996, we're of the generation that embraced the condom code when it was suggested that there would be ways to avoid transmission of HIV. We are the generation that put love of community ahead of self-interest and love of self, and we did that in remarkable ways that should be studied intensely for generations to come. When this pandemic hit, I think we were among the first to embrace what they now call non-pharmaceutical interventions, NPIs, mask wearing, glove wearing, eye shield wearing. We knew how to modify our own compartment in a way that would help bring community spread down. And I noticed from my circle of friends and acquaintances that really some model behavior was practiced by the community, and I really applauded that. There's another connection, Jim, that generation also, through activism, through direct action, through grassroots organizing, through self-education, and through the creation of the citizen science movement, interacted with the entire bench of HIV researchers in ways that taught those researchers a sense of urgency in the work that they're doing, and helped really bring about the those drugs in 1996. Those same researchers were the ones on the ground when COVID hit.
Sure.
And we recognize them in the film. There are people in the film who are there must be a way to turn this off. There are people in the film you recognize from How to Survive a Plague. You know, the same researchers, and they didn't need gay men and lesbians and people with HIV to come and teach them again how to do these things in an ethical way. They learned that lesson, and they started this pandemic as activists themselves. They brought that spirit of HIV activism, anti-AIDS activism, to the job of looking at this new coronavirus and charting a course through it.
Exactly. I do know some people who have said, while they're happy that vaccinations are around and vaccinations are available, there's some bitterness in the fact that it took really just over a year for vaccination to come to the forefront, while people who have dealt with AIDS and HIV over the years, there's still no cure. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's the very same people who brought us the COVID vaccines who have been working on the vaccine for HIV. And they've been working, for decades without any success, not for lack of support or lack of desire. We can't blame them. HIV is a monstrous virus and one with many secrets that have yet to be unlocked. What we recognize is that those decades of failure in HIV vaccine work really brought the entire scientific establishment forward. All those novel platforms that are used now in the COVID vaccines, mRNA, the viral vectors, they were all developed in efforts to try to counter HIV.
Sure.
And the global network of clinical trial sites that was stood up by all those HIV researchers, and they finally had this victory that was so heartwarming and necessary. And I don't think there's any blame on their part. But what I do know is they are now turning back to HIV with this real sense of renewed purpose and optimism because of the successes that they had here. It's a much more complex disease, HIV is, and it has people at the forefront of this scientific world who are really committed to and dedicated to finding the final ultimate solution to the HIV pandemic. And that includes Tony Fauci, who has been the head of the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Disease since the early days of HIV. He played such a key role in this. He's now 81 years old and has no plans to retire until they find those secrets in HIV, and he's able to say that his work in HIV is done, and he expects he'll stay at his job into his 90s. And I for one hope he does. He's remarkable. Or I hope he finds the cure to HIV, next year and is able to retire right away.
Exactly. David, you've dealt with so many LGBTQ themes in your films. Can you talk about the importance of doing so?
Well, when I started in documentary filmmaking, which is 10 years ago, and I like to say just 10 years ago, but I guess that seems like a lot of time now. I had the feeling that the stories from our community were not being brought up into the canon of human civilization. Our efforts to collect our history have always been shared amongst ourselves in ways that is really important and affirming. But I saw the many ways that our community, our movements, our communities, I should say, have changed the world and have left a legacy, a beneficial legacy to everybody. And that's what moved me into trying to tell parts of our history to future generations. It was to say, look, these are game-changing, history-changing people and moments, and they belong to everybody and should be celebrated by everybody and should be taught and learned by everybody. So that was my motivation, at least in those 3 films that I made, which are a kind of a trilogy of radical queer activism and the way it transformed everything.
Thank you for that. It seems like over the last month or so, masks have vanished. People are doing normal things again. People are out and about. Do you feel like we've gone too fast in that direction?
You know, I don't know. I've just returned from Denmark, where they not only drifted in that direction, but they actually closed down all their COVID testing sites, and there's not a mask to be seen in the country. And they said, you know, with this with a large percentage of their population vaccinated, larger than ours, and with Omicron being easily countered by the vaccines, they said, bring it on. And we see the success that had in Denmark. I'm not an epidemiologist, and I don't want to give any advice to people, but I think that we are still learning about how to moderate our risks through all of this, and hopefully the vaccines that are chronicled in How to Survive a Pandemic and the people who produce them, hopefully they will allow us in short time to just start thinking this is another flu that we get vaccinated against every year. And, you know, the flu still claims tens of thousands of lives. It's still fatal, but we have, as a society and community, accepted that as an acceptable number of losses to flu for the people who don't take the vaccines, especially. And I think that we're moving in that direction in COVID. I hope that we'll have a feeling of kind of a post-pandemic return to something, or maybe not a return to something of the past, but a resumption of the future. And hopefully it's a future that is more just and equitable, and one where we have where we can feel confident that we're going to survive it.
Great. I think I have time for one more quick question. What are you working on next?
That's a good question. I don't really have an answer. I'm working on a whole bunch of possible projects. This one has kept us busy right until yesterday. And today, of course, on the 29th, it drops on HBO. And so tomorrow may bring something new and exciting, I hope.
Okay, great. David France, the documentary is How to Survive a Pandemic. It is currently on HBO and is extraordinary. Thank you so much for this and for your body of work. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Jim. Take care.
Thanks so much, David.
Bye.